This episode is a TrackPads.com production.
Fought in November 1917, Cambrai was not simply the dramatic arrival of the tank on a large scale. It was a battlefield experiment in surprise, coordination, technology, and adaptation. British Mark IV tanks helped crack the Hindenburg Line, one of the strongest German defensive systems on the Western Front, but they could not, by themselves, turn breakthrough into victory. That is why Cambrai still matters. It showed the promise of armored warfare, but it also revealed a hard truth that armies are still learning in different ways today. No machine wins a battle alone. Before sunrise on November 20th, 1917, the British attack began without the usual warning. There was no long preliminary bombardment to announce that an offensive was coming. There were no days of shellfire tearing the battlefield apart in advance. Instead, line. For the men waiting behind them, the tanks represented both hope and uncertainty. These were not sleek, modern armored vehicles. They were slow, loud, hot, cramped machines. They were difficult to steer and prone to breakdown. Inside, crews worked in choking noise and fumes, surrounded by armor that could protect them from some dangers while trapping them inside others. Still, against barbed wire, trenches, and machine gun positions, the tank offered something infantry had desperately needed. It offered a way through. Cambrai's first hours were unlike the familiar pattern of Western Front offensives. The British Army was not simply trying to batter its way forward with artillery and manpower. It was attempting to use tanks as part of a larger system. Artillery would fire by surprise. Infantry would advance behind the machines. Engineers would move forward to deal with obstacles. Aircraft would watch from above. Cavalry waited behind the attack, ready for the moment when a rupture might become a breakthrough. That morning mattered because it briefly made the impossible seem possible. The Hindenburg Line had been built to resist exactly this kind of assault. Yet, as the tanks moved forward and the infantry followed, Cambrai became more than another attack. It became a test of whether modern machines, careful planning, and surprise could break the deadlock of trench warfare. Cambrai was not chosen by accident. By late 1917, the Western Front had taught both sides a brutal lesson. Courage alone could not solve trenches, wire, artillery, and machine guns. Too many offensives had begun with massive bombardments that warned the enemy, shattered the ground, and left attacking infantry struggling through mud and shell craters before they even reached the real fight. The ground around Cambrai offered a different possibility. Compared with the ruined mud of Flanders, it was firmer and better suited for tanks. That mattered because early tanks were still mechanically fragile. They needed ground they could cross, routes they could follow, and conditions that gave them at least a chance of reaching the enemy wire and trenches before breaking down or becoming trapped. The target was also important. The Hindenburg Line was not just another trench system. It was a deep, carefully prepared defensive belt built to absorb attacks and punish infantry as they advanced. If the British could crack it at Cambrai, the result would be more than a local success. It would suggest that tanks, surprise, and coordination might offer a new way to attack fortified positions. So Cambrai became both a battlefield and a test case. The British Army wanted to know whether tanks could do what artillery and infantry had so often failed to do on their own. The answer would not be simple, but on the eve of the attack, the plan carried enormous promise. Choose better ground, preserve surprise, mass the tanks,
rupture the German line before the defenders could react.
The plan was built around a simple but ambitious idea: attack before the Germans realized what was coming. Earlier offensives often began with long artillery bombardments. Those bombardments could destroy defenses, but they also warned the enemy to prepare. At Cambrai, the British hoped to avoid that familiar pattern. The guns would open suddenly, the tanks would move forward, the infantry would follow quickly behind them. The defenders, in theory, would have too little time to understand what was happening before the line was already under pressure. The tanks had a specific job. They were expected to crush barbed wire, cross trenches, suppress strongpoints, and create lanes for the infantry. This was one of the great promises of the Mark IV tank. It did not need roads in the way wheeled vehicles did. It could move across obstacles that had stopped infantry again and again. In theory, tanks could turn the worst features of trench warfare into problems that could be crossed, crushed, or bypassed. But Cambrai was never supposed to be a tank attack alone. Artillery had to strike German positions at the right moment. Infantry had to move close enough behind the tanks to take and hold ground. Engineers had to deal with obstacles, crossings, and battlefield repairs. Aircraft helped observe the fight from above. Cavalry waited behind the attack, ready to ride through if the German line truly broke open. That last expectation showed both the ambition and the uncertainty of the plan. British commanders still imagined that a breakthrough might restore mobility to the battlefield. If the tanks opened the door, perhaps cavalry could pass through it and turn a local success into something much larger. Cambrai was therefore a strange mix of old and new. Steel machines led the way, mounted troops waited in reserve, and an army that had spent years in the trenches tried to discover whether the Western Front could still be broken wide open. At first, the attack seemed to work. The shock effect was real. Tanks crossed obstacles that had once seemed almost impossible. Infantry moved forward behind them. German defenders were caught by surprise in places where the British plan worked as intended. For a brief moment, Cambrai appeared to point toward a new kind of warfare. But as the first day gave way to the days that followed, Cambrai became less a story of sudden breakthrough and more a story of battlefield friction. The tanks had done what many doubters thought they could not do, but early armored warfare was still fragile. Machines broke down, some became stuck, others ran out of momentum or were knocked out. Crews fought inside brutal conditions, while infantry units struggled to keep pace, reorganize, and hold what had been gained. The battlefield itself also began to resist the plan. Villages, ridges, trenches, roads, canals, and strong points turned the advance into a series of difficult local fights. Communication became harder as units moved forward. Commanders could not always see clearly what was happening. Success in one place did not automatically become success somewhere else. The clean lines of the plan gave way to the confusion of battle. The Germans, meanwhile, recovered from the shock. Cambrai is important because it did not end with British tanks rolling triumphantly through the defensive system. German forces adapted. They reinforced threatened areas. They studied what had happened. Then they prepared a counterattack. When that counterattack came, it showed that innovation on one side rarely goes unanswered. The defender studies. The defender reacts. The defender looks for weaknesses. The German counterattack turned Cambrai from a celebration into a warning. Ground that had been won at great effort could still be lost. Technology had opened a path, but it had not solved the larger problems of endurance, coordination, supply, reserves, and command. Cambrai proved that tanks could change the battlefield. It also proved that the enemy still had a vote. So, what did Cambrai really prove? It did not prove that tanks could win battles by themselves. It proved something more important and more complicated. Tanks could make a breakthrough possible, but they needed an entire battlefield system around them to turn that breakthrough into victory. Armor mattered, but so did infantry, artillery, engineers, communications, logistics, aircraft, reserves, and command decisions made under pressure.
That is why Cambrai still feels modern. The battle was not just about new machinery. It was about the challenge of integrating new technology into an old way of war. The British Army had found a weapon that could help overcome wire and trenches, but it had not yet mastered the full method needed to exploit success, sustain momentum, and defeat a determined enemy response.
The Germans learned as well. Their counterattack showed that no innovation remains one-sided for long. Surprise can open a battle, but adaptation shapes what happens next. Cambrai became both a breakthrough and a cautionary tale. The tank had arrived, but the age of armored warfare was still being learned at terrible cost.
More than a century later, the Battle of Cambrai remains one of the clearest examples of war changing in real time. It was a battle of steel, mud, ambition, and hard lessons. It showed the future before armies fully understood how to use it.
And that is why Cambrai remains essential to understanding the road from trench warfare to modern combined arms.
That story is at the heart of my new book and podcast, Cambrai, The First Great Tank Offensive. It is not only a story about machines crossing trenches. It is a story about soldiers, commanders, technology, risk, adaptation, and the difficult moment when the future of warfare first began to grind forward on tracks.
This is a trackpads.com production. More military history books and productions are available at trackpads.com and militaryauthor.me.